The barking erupted like rolling thunder across Fort Bragg's canine training compound. Not one dog, not 10. 100 military working dogs simultaneously shattered formation, lunging against their handlers, straining toward the command center's eastern corridor as if an invisible force had seized control of their collective will. Chief Warrant Officer Cole Barrett's coffee cup hit the concrete floor, shattering into a dozen pieces he didn't bother acknowledging. 23 years in SEAL teams, 14 combat deployments, and he had never witnessed anything remotely resembling the chaos unfolding before him. "Control your animals, now!" His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question, veins protruding along his neck like knuckles under tension. The handlers scrambled, whistles shrieked, hand signals flashed through the morning air. German commands, Dutch commands, the universal language of desperate men losing control of weapons they'd spent years calibrating. Nothing worked. Shadow, the Belgian Malinois who led the pack, had earned his reputation through 18 months of refusing human contact beyond his assigned handler. 3 trainers had requested transfers after working with him. 1 had required stitches. The dog existed as a 4-legged weapon of singular purpose, loyal to mission parameters and nothing else. Now Shadow was running, not attacking, running towards something with a determination that made Barrett's tactical instincts scream warnings he couldn't identify. And then Barrett saw the destination. A woman stood frozen in the eastern corridor, her gray janitorial uniform hanging loose on a frame that couldn't have exceeded 120 pounds. The mop had fallen from her grip, spreading dirty water across tiles she'd probably spent an hour cleaning. Her eyes, dark and wide, reflected a terror that seemed genuine, or perhaps something else entirely. Shadow reached her first, and Barrett's hand instinctively moved toward the sidearm he wasn't carrying. The dog's jaws could generate 350 pounds of pressure per square inch. He'd seen what those teeth could do to human flesh, but Shadow didn't attack. The most dangerous dog in the entire canine program was licking her hand. His tail wagged with an enthusiasm Barrett had never witnessed from the animal, moving so fast it blurred. And one by one, the other dogs arrived, surrounding the woman in concentric circles, lowering themselves to the ground in protective positions that mimicked nothing in their training protocols. 97, 98, 99, 100. Every single military working dog assembled for Operation Cerberus now lay at the feet of a cleaning woman, whose name Barrett didn't know, and whose presence he'd ordered removed from the restricted area less than 5 minutes ago. He approached slowly, every step measured, watching for any sign of aggression from the canine perimeter that had formed around her. The dogs tracked his movement but didn't rise. They simply watched, their eyes carrying an intelligence that felt uncomfortably close to judgment. "Who are you?" Barrett demanded, stopping 3 meters from the outer ring of fur and muscle. His voice carried the cold precision of an interrogator, not a question, but a command. The woman didn't answer. Her gaze had dropped to Shadow, and something shifted in her expression. The fear dissolved, replaced by an emotion Barrett couldn't immediately categorize. Her hand, trembling slightly, reached down to touch the dog's head. Shadow pressed into her palm like a puppy seeking comfort from its mother. A single tear traced down the woman's cheek, cutting a clean line through the faint dust that had accumulated during her morning shift. The command center had fallen silent. 47 personnel stood frozen at various points throughout the facility, witnesses to something that defied every principle of military working dog behavior. These animals had been conditioned through thousands of training hours to respond only to authorized handlers. They didn't simply abandon that programming because a stranger walked past their kennels. Yet, here they were, 100 of America's most valuable canine assets, arranged in formation around a janitor as if she were the commander-in-chief herself. Barrett's earpiece crackled. "Chief, Colonel Ashford is requesting a situation report. He's en route from Building 7. Tell the colonel we have a containment issue," Barrett replied, never taking his eyes off the woman. "And tell him to bring the K-9 unit commander. We're going to need answers." The woman finally looked up, meeting Barrett's gaze with an expression that held neither defiance nor submission, just a quiet acceptance that suggested she'd been expecting this moment far longer than the 5 minutes since the chaos began. "I don't know why," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why they came to me." Barrett had interrogated terrorists who'd undergone resistance training. He'd extracted information from men who'd rather die than talk. He knew what deception looked like, how it moved through facial muscles and vocal patterns and the micro-expressions that revealed truth regardless of the words being spoken. This woman was lying. But what she was lying about, and why 100 military dogs had chosen her as their focal point, remained mysteries that Barrett intended to solve before the sun reached its zenith. The morning had begun with routine. It would not end that way. Lieutenant Nicole Stafford arrived at the K-9 compound with the particular energy of someone whose authority had been publicly challenged. As the newly appointed commander of the K-9 training division, she had spent 6 months establishing her credentials among handlers who'd initially questioned whether a woman could lead their unit effectively. She had answered those questions through competence, discipline, and an unwillingness to accept anything less than perfection. Now her dogs, every single one of them, had abandoned their posts for a cleaning woman. "What the hell happened here?" Stafford's voice cut through the murmured conversations that had begun among the gathered personnel. She pushed through the crowd, her compact frame radiating an intensity that made larger soldiers step aside. When she reached the inner perimeter and saw the tableau before her, she stopped cold. "Lieutenant," Barrett nodded toward the woman at the center. "We have a situation." "I can see that, Chief." Stafford's eyes swept across the dogs, cataloging each animal, noting their positions and postures. These were her responsibility, her reputation, and they were currently arranged around a civilian, like a Secret Service detail protecting a dignitary. "Who is she?" "Janitorial staff. Name tag says Sarah. No last name visible." "Sarah." Stafford stepped forward, and immediately 6 dogs raised their heads, ears rotating toward her like radar dishes tracking an incoming threat. She froze. In 14 years of working with military dogs, she had never been perceived as a threat by an animal under her command. "Sarah, what did you do to my dogs?" The woman, Sarah, shook her head slowly. Her hand continued stroking Shadow's fur in a rhythm that seemed almost unconscious, the gesture of someone who had performed this motion thousands of times before. "Nothing, ma'am. I was just cleaning. They came to me." "Dogs don't just come to people," Stafford's voice sharpened. "Certainly not military working dogs with 18 months of specialized training. What did you use? What chemical compound? What frequency device?" "I don't have anything like that." "Then explain this." Stafford gestured at the surrounding animals. "Explain why 100 dogs worth approximately $12 million in training investment have decided to abandon their handlers for a woman who mops floors." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Almost. "I can't explain what I don't understand." Barrett caught the micro-expression, filed it away for later analysis. This woman understood far more than she was admitting. The question was why she'd chosen this moment to reveal herself, and what she hoped to accomplish by remaining silent. Sergeant First Class Brad Lawson pushed through the crowd, his face carrying the particular shade of crimson that indicated both embarrassment and rage. As the senior handler, Shadow fell under his direct responsibility. The dog's behavior reflected on his competence, his training methods, his entire professional identity. "That's my dog," Lawson pointed at Shadow, who hadn't moved from Sarah's side. "That animal cost the United States government $800,000 to train. He doesn't respond to anyone except me." He stepped forward aggressively. "So, I'm going to ask you once, very politely, to step away from my dog." Shadow's head snapped toward Lawson. The growl that emerged from the dog's chest resonated at a frequency that vibrated through the air itself, a sound that every person present recognized as a final warning before violence. Lawson stumbled backward, his face shifting from red to white in the span of a heartbeat. In 3 years of handling Shadow, the dog had never, not once, growled at him. Challenged him, yes, ignored commands occasionally, but this sound, this promise of imminent harm, was entirely new. "Sergeant, step back." Barrett's command carried no room for discussion. "Everyone, maintain distance until we understand what we're dealing with." The crowd complied, expanding the perimeter around Sarah and her canine protectors. Barrett noticed several handlers reaching for their phones, the instinct to document overriding their training. He made a mental note to confiscate those devices before this situation leaked beyond the compound walls. Master Sergeant Lisa Patterson had observed the entire scene from the doorway of Building 3, her position offering both a clear sightline and plausible distance from the chaos. 22 years in military service had taught her when to act and when to watch. This moment demanded observation. Something about the woman at the center didn't align with the janitorial uniform she wore. The posture was wrong. Despite her apparent fear, despite the trembling and the tears, Sarah stood with her weight balanced evenly across both feet, shoulders squared in a manner that suggested preparation rather than panic. Her head moved in a pattern Patterson recognized, the constant environmental scanning of someone trained to identify threats before they materialized. And her hands. Patterson had spent enough time around canine handlers to recognize the calluses that formed from years of working with leads and training equipment. This woman's hands, visible now as she continued stroking Shadow's coat, carried those marks. But it was the way Sarah's fingers moved that truly caught Patterson's attention. The stroking wasn't random. It followed a specific pattern, pressure applied at particular points, a sequence that meant nothing to casual observers, but everything to someone who had studied canine psychology at the advanced level. Patterson had seen that technique exactly once before, in a classified training video she wasn't supposed to remember watching. Phantom Protocol, she whispered to herself, the words lost in the ambient noise of the compound. Her heart rate elevated. That program had been shut down 8 years ago. Everyone associated with it had been reassigned, retired, or in some cases, simply disappeared from official records. Yet here was a woman using techniques that shouldn't exist anymore, surrounded by dogs responding to her presence as if they'd known her their entire lives. Patterson pulled out her phone, not to record, but to access a database she technically didn't have authorization to query. If her suspicions were correct, this situation had just become far more complicated than a behavioral anomaly. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story of hidden valor and the unbreakable bond between warriors, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We bring you incredible true military stories every week. Your subscription helps us honor those who served in the shadows. Now, let's see what happens when 100 military dogs refuse to obey anyone except a woman everyone dismissed as nobody. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the compound, as Colonel James Ashford's vehicle pulled to a stop outside the canine facility. At 58 years old, Ashford carried the weathered authority of someone who had seen enough military crises to recognize the difference between genuine emergencies and theatrical inconveniences. This situation, based on the reports crackling through his radio during the drive, sounded like the former. He emerged from the vehicle and immediately felt the tension that saturated the air. Personnel stood in clusters, their attention focused on a central point near Building 2. The dogs, which should have been in their kennels preparing for the day's training exercises, were nowhere in their designated locations. "Colonel," Barrett intercepted him halfway across the parking lot. "Sir, we have an unprecedented situation." "Define unprecedented, Chief." "Every MWD assigned to Operation Cerberus has abandoned their handlers and formed a protective perimeter around a civilian contractor." Barrett gestured toward the crowd. "They're not responding to any commands. They've shown aggressive behavior toward anyone who approaches with hostile intent." Ashford processed this information without visible reaction. "Hostile intent? They're determining intent now?" "Sir, when Sergeant Lawson attempted to physically separate his dog from the woman, the animal responded with threat displays I've never observed in my career. These dogs are reading the room and acting accordingly." "Who's the civilian?" "Janitorial staff. Name is Sarah. No surname confirmed yet. She claims ignorance regarding the dog's behavior." "You don't believe her?" "No, sir, I do not." Ashford nodded once, then strode toward the gathering with Barrett at his shoulder. The crowd parted as he approached, personnel recognizing the base commander's authority and clearing a path without needing to be told. When he reached the inner perimeter and saw the arrangement of dogs around the woman, he stopped. His face revealed nothing. 23 years of command had perfected his ability to process shocking information without displaying surprise. But internally, alarm bells he hadn't heard since his last combat deployment were ringing with increasing urgency. "Lieutenant Stafford," he addressed the canine commander, who stood rigid near the edge of the canine formation. "Status report. Sir, at approximately 0645, all 100 military working dogs assigned to Operation Cerberus broke containment simultaneously. They converged on this location and established protective positions around the civilian you see before you. All attempts to reassert control have failed. Have we identified any external factors? Chemical agents, electronic devices, anything that might explain this behavior?" "Negative, sir. We've swept the area." Nothing unusual detected. Ashford turned his attention to Sarah. The woman met his gaze with an expression that seemed carefully neutral, neither challenging his authority nor cowering before it. She continued her rhythmic stroking of the lead dog's fur, her fingers moving in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. "Ma'am," his voice carried the measured tone of someone accustomed to extracting truth from unwilling sources. "I'm Colonel James Ashford, commanding officer of this installation. You understand that what's happening here is highly irregular." "Yes, sir." Her voice was stronger now, the earlier trembling absent. "I understand how this must look. Then perhaps you can help me understand why it's happening." Sarah's hand paused briefly on Shadow's head before resuming its motion. "Colonel, I've worked here for 11 months. I clean floors, empty trash, maintain the facilities. I've never interacted with the dogs beyond seeing them during training exercises. Yet they seem to know you quite well. I can't explain that." "Can't or won't?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah's expression flickered, something passing behind her eyes too quickly for Ashford to identify. Then the mask was back in place, the careful neutrality of someone accustomed to concealing their true nature. "Colonel," Lieutenant Stafford interjected, "with respect, this woman's presence is compromising our operational readiness. Operation Cerberus launches in 46 hours. We need these dogs returned to their handlers and this situation resolved." "I'm aware of the timeline, Lieutenant." Ashford's tone carried a subtle edge that reminded everyone present of their relative positions in the command structure. He returned his attention to Sarah. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to remain here while we sort this out. Please don't interpret that as an accusation. Consider it a precaution." Sarah nodded once. "I understand, sir." Specialist Ryan Fletcher had been watching from the crowd, his young face contorted with suspicion that had been building since the first dog broke containment. At 23, he represented the newest generation of canine handlers, trained in modern techniques and suspicious of anything that deviated from established protocols. This woman, this supposed janitor, represented a deviation he couldn't reconcile. "Sir," he stepped forward, addressing Colonel Ashford directly in a breach of protocol that earned him sharp looks from several senior NCOs. "Permission to speak freely." Ashford's eyebrow rose slightly. "Granted, Specialist, though I suggest you choose your words carefully." "Sir, there's no natural explanation for what we're witnessing. Dogs don't behave this way without conditioning. Someone trained them to respond to this woman, which means someone infiltrated our program." Fletcher pointed at Sarah with undisguised hostility. "She's either a spy or an asset for someone who wants to compromise Operation Cerberus. We should detain her immediately and sweep this entire facility for additional security breaches." "That's quite an accusation, Specialist." "It's the only logical conclusion, sir. Military working dogs don't abandon years of training because a cleaning lady walks past their kennels. Something is very wrong here, and she's at the center of it." Sarah remained silent during Fletcher's accusation, but her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. The vulnerability that had characterized her earlier demeanor hardened into something more controlled, more deliberate. Those watching closely might have noticed her weight redistribute, her stance becoming the foundation for either defense or departure. The dogs noticed. Several heads lifted from their resting positions, ears tracking the elevated tension in Fletcher's voice. Shadow's growl returned, low and constant, a warning that the young specialist ignored at his potential peril. "Specialist Fletcher," Colonel Ashford's voice carried the weight of command, "your concerns are noted and will be investigated through proper channels. In the meantime, you will stand down and allow this situation to be handled by appropriate personnel. Is that understood?" Fletcher's jaw tightened, rebellion flickering across his features before training reasserted itself. "Yes, sir. Understood." But as he stepped back into the crowd, his eyes remained fixed on Sarah with an intensity that promised this wouldn't be the end of his involvement. The veterinary team arrived at 0730. Summoned by Ashford's directive to ensure the dogs hadn't been subjected to any chemical or biological agents that might explain their behavior. Doc Mitchell led the group, a stocky man in his early 50s whose experience with military working dogs spanned 3 decades and 4 continents. "Colonel," Mitchell approached Ashford while his team began setting up examination equipment. "I've reviewed the initial reports. I'll be honest, sir, nothing in my experience provides a framework for understanding what's happened here. Nonetheless, Doctor, I need answers." "I understand. We'll begin with blood draws and behavioral assessments. However," Mitchell glanced towards Sarah and the dogs surrounding her. Getting access to the animals may prove challenging. They won't let you approach? We tested the perimeter 5 minutes ago. Any movement toward the woman triggers defensive responses from the nearest animals. They have essentially created a living barrier. Ashford absorbed this information with growing unease. What about the woman herself? Any chance she's carrying something that's affecting them? Pheromones? Subsonic emitters? We'll need to examine her as well, but that requires her cooperation and access we currently don't have. Mitchell paused, his clinical detachment momentarily giving way to something more personal. Sir, I've worked with MWDs my entire career. I've seen bonding, loyalty, protective instincts, but this, he gestured toward the formation, this transcends anything in our behavioral models. These dogs aren't just protecting her, they're following her. Look at their positioning. Ashford looked more carefully at the arrangement of animals around Sarah. Mitchell was right. This wasn't a random defensive cluster. The dogs had arranged themselves in concentric rings with clear sight lines and overlapping fields of protection. It was a tactical formation, the kind that required coordination and command structure to execute. And at the center of it all, a woman continued stroking Shadow's fur, as if this were the most natural situation in the world. The first genuine crack in Sarah's facade appeared just before 0800, triggered by a sound that made everyone present hold their breath. Luna, a Belgian Malinois positioned in the second ring of dogs, suddenly collapsed. One moment she stood alert, her attention fixed on the perimeter. The next, she was on the ground, her body convulsing, legs kicking at the air in movements that spoke of serious neurological distress. "Dog down!" one of the handlers shouted, instinctively moving forward before remembering the consequences of such movement. Doc Mitchell grabbed his emergency kit. "I need access to that animal. Colonel, we need to clear a path." But the other dogs hadn't moved. Despite the obvious distress of one of their own, they maintained their positions, their attention fixed on the perimeter rather than the suffering animal in their midst. Only Shadow responded, rising from his position beside Sarah and moving to stand over Luna, his body language radiating distress. Sarah's transformation was immediate and absolute. The vulnerable janitor vanished, replaced by someone whose movements carried the efficiency of extensive training. She pushed through the dogs surrounding her, her body language commanding them to part rather than requesting permission. They obeyed without hesitation, creating a corridor that she traveled in seconds. She dropped to her knees beside Luna, her hands moving to specific points on the dog's body with precision that came from years of practice rather than panic. Her fingers found the pulse point at the inner thigh, counted silently for 3 seconds, then moved to examine the dog's gums. Pale mucous membranes, weak pulse, possible foreign body obstruction in the forelimb. Her voice had changed. Gone was the quiet uncertainty. In its place, the crisp delivery of someone accustomed to emergency situations. "Doc Mitchell, I need your kit, now." Mitchell hesitated for only a heartbeat before moving forward. The dogs parted for him as well, creating a path to where Sarah knelt over Luna. He handed her the emergency bag, his eyes widening as she opened it, and immediately selected the correct instruments without asking for guidance. "Ruhig, Mädchen. Ich bin hier," Sarah murmured to the convulsing dog. "Calm, girl. I'm here." The German flowed from her lips with the fluency of native speakers, the words carrying a specific cadence that Mitchell had encountered only once before, years ago, in a training program he'd been sworn never to discuss. Her hands worked with mechanical precision, examining Luna's leg where the convulsions seemed to originate. She found the problem quickly, a piece of wire that had embedded itself in the dog's flesh, invisible beneath the fur, but clearly causing severe pain and muscular response. Foreign object, approximately 3 centimeters deep, possible nerve involvement. Sarah looked up at Mitchell, her eyes carrying the authority of someone who expected her assessment to be taken seriously. "I need forceps, local anesthetic, and 2 cc's of diazepam for the convulsions." "Those are controlled substances," Mitchell replied automatically, even as his hands moved to prepare the requested items. "You'd need authorization. The dog will be dead in 5 minutes if those convulsions don't stop. Consider this my authorization." Mitchell made the decision that any good medical professional would make. He handed her the syringe. Sarah found the vein on the first attempt, her technique flawless, the muscle memory of someone who had performed this procedure hundreds of times before. The diazepam entered Luna's system, and within 30 seconds, the convulsions began to subside. Throughout the compound, Witnesses watched in stunned silence as a janitor performed emergency veterinary medicine with the competence of a trained specialist. Colonel Ashford's expression had shifted from suspicion to intense calculation. Lieutenant Stafford's hostility had given way to confusion. Even Fletcher, who had been so certain of Sarah's malicious intent, stood motionless as she worked to save the dog's life. Sarah extracted the wire fragment with steady hands, cleaned the wound, and applied a field dressing that would serve until proper surgical intervention could be arranged. When she finished, Luna's breathing had stabilized, her eyes no longer rolling with pain, but focused on the woman who had provided relief. The dog's tongue emerged, licking Sarah's hand in the universal canine gesture of gratitude and recognition. "How did you know to do that?" Mitchell asked, his voice carrying equal parts professional admiration and personal bewilderment. "That technique, those commands, where did you learn them?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She continued checking Luna's vital signs, her fingers monitoring the pulse as the sedative took full effect. When she finally looked up, her expression had closed again, the brief glimpse of competence retreating behind the mask she'd worn since the morning began. "I know dogs," she said simply. "I've always known dogs." Mitchell shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, with respect, that wasn't general knowledge. Those German commands, that handling technique, that's old-school Schutzhund methodology. Nobody uses that approach anymore except—" He trailed off, his mind connecting dots that formed a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see. "Except specialized programs that officially don't exist. I don't know what you're talking about. Ma'am, I've been working with military dogs for 30 years. I know what I just witnessed. That wasn't a cleaning lady saving a dog. That was a trained professional executing established medical protocols with muscle memory that takes years to develop." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Who are you?" Before Sarah could respond, the crowd parted to admit Captain Dennis Crawford, the installation's intelligence officer. His arrival carried the energy of someone who had been waiting for an excuse to intervene and had finally found one. "Colonel Ashford," Crawford's voice cut through the ambient noise, "we've run the preliminary background on the civilian." He held a tablet displaying information Sarah couldn't see from her position. "The name she's been using, Sarah Hendricks, appears in the employment system, but the supporting documentation is problematic." "Problematic how?" "The social security number traces to a Maria Santos from El Paso, Texas. The address on file is a vacant lot. The references she provided for the janitorial position are disconnected numbers." Crawford fixed Sarah with the cold stare of someone who had built a career on identifying deception. "She's not who she claims to be." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Specialist Fletcher's earlier accusations now carried the weight of apparent validation. Even some who had begun to sympathize with Sarah during her treatment of Luna found themselves reconsidering. "Ma'am," Colonel Ashford's voice remained measured, but an edge had entered his tone. "Would you care to explain these discrepancies?" Sarah rose slowly from her position beside Luna, her hands still carrying traces of the antiseptic she'd used during the procedure. The dogs around her had reorganized, closing ranks now that the immediate medical crisis had passed. Shadow returned to his position at her side, his body pressed against her leg in a gesture that spoke of both protection and loyalty. "Colonel, I can explain everything, but not here, not like this." "I'm afraid you don't have the luxury of choosing the circumstances, ma'am. Captain Crawford's findings suggest you've infiltrated this installation under false pretenses. That's a federal offense, potentially related to espionage given the sensitive nature of operations conducted here." "I'm not a spy." "Then what are you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications that extended far beyond a simple identity verification. Sarah's jaw worked silently, internal conflict playing across her features in ways that surveillance training couldn't fully suppress. She wanted to speak, that much was clear. Something was holding her back. "Colonel," Captain Crawford stepped forward, "under the circumstances, I recommend immediate detention pending a full security review. We cannot allow an unidentified individual with unexplained influence over military assets to remain at liberty within this facility." "Your recommendation is noted, Captain." "Sir, with Operation Cerberus 44 hours from launch, we cannot afford to—" "I said your recommendation is noted." Ashford's voice carried a finality that silenced Crawford mid-sentence. The colonel's attention remained fixed on Sarah, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, I'm going to give you one opportunity to provide context for what's happening here. I suggest you use it wisely." Sarah looked down at Shadow, then at the other dogs who had abandoned everything they had been trained to do simply because she had walked past their kennels. Her hand reached down, fingers tracing the scar tissue along Shadow's ear, where some previous injury had left its permanent mark. "They know me," she finally said, her voice carrying a resignation that suggested she'd been dreading this moment for a long time. "These dogs, they know me because—" She trailed off, and in that moment of hesitation, Master Sergeant Patterson emerged from the rear of the crowd, pushing through with an urgency that demanded attention. "Colonel Ashford, sir, I need to speak with you immediately, in private." "Sergeant, this is hardly the appropriate—" "Sir, it concerns Phantom Unit. And what I'm about to tell you changes everything." The words struck the gathered personnel like a physical force. Those who knew the name, Phantom Unit, reacted with visible shock. Those who didn't recognize that something significant had just been revealed, even if they couldn't identify what. Colonel Ashford's facade finally cracked, something passing behind his eyes that looked remarkably like fear. "Everyone except essential personnel, clear the area. Now." The compound erupted into controlled chaos as soldiers, handlers, and support staff began evacuating the immediate vicinity. Through it all, Sarah remained motionless at the center of her canine protectors, her expression suggesting she knew exactly what Patterson had discovered, and that the truth, once revealed, could never be contained again. The conference room on the third floor of Building 1 had been swept for listening devices twice in the past hour. Colonel Ashford sat at the head of the table, his fingers steepled before him in a pose that conveyed deep contemplation. Across from him, Master Sergeant Patterson laid out the evidence she'd assembled during the chaos below. "Phantom Unit was established in 2008, Patterson began, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone delivering a briefing that could end careers. "It was a black program designed to create the most advanced military working dog teams in history. Not just dogs, Colonel. Complete handler dog units with capabilities that exceeded anything in conventional forces. I'm aware of Phantom Unit's general purpose, Sergeant. It was discontinued." "Yes, sir, officially. After Operation Dark Shepherd in 2021, the program was terminated, all records classified at the highest levels, and surviving personnel were reassigned or—" She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Or they were erased." Ashford's expression didn't change. "Erased. Personnel files deleted, service records scrubbed. Anyone who knew about the program was given new identities and scattered to installations where they'd never be connected to their previous assignments." Patterson pulled up an image on her tablet. The program's highest-rated handler was a Master Chief named Sarah Hendricks. She trained 847 dogs during her tenure. Her success rate was unprecedented. 0 handler casualties, 98% mission success, and a survival rate for her dogs that defied statistical probability. What happened to her? According to official records, she died during Operation Dark Shepherd along with 23 other Phantom Unit personnel. They were inserted into Kandahar province to extract high-value targets. Something went wrong. The entire team was declared killed in action. Patterson zoomed in on a photograph, a group of soldiers standing before a transport aircraft. One face had been highlighted. "Colonel, the woman downstairs matches Phantom Unit file photographs of Master Chief Sarah Hendricks. Age adjusted for the time that's passed, but the facial structure, the distinguishing marks. It's her." Ashford stared at the image for a long moment. "You're telling me that a soldier who was declared dead 3 years ago has been working as a janitor on my installation for the past 11 months. "Yes, sir." "And the dogs downstairs, the ones assigned to Operation Cerberus, somehow recognized her, despite never having encountered her during their training." "Sir, those dogs were bred from Phantom Unit bloodlines. The program created a specialized breeding population designed to produce superior military working dogs. When Phantom Unit was shut down, those dogs were distributed throughout the military's canine programs." Patterson pulled up another document. 87 of the 100 dogs currently assigned to Operation Cerberus can be traced directly to Phantom Unit breeding stock. 31 of them were actually born during the program's operation. "You're suggesting they remember her?" "I'm suggesting they were imprinted on her, sir. Not through training, but through bonding that occurred during their earliest developmental stages. These dogs spent their first 8 weeks of life in Sarah Hendricks' care. She was the first human they knew, the first voice they heard, the first hands that fed and sheltered them." Patterson's voice softened. "To them, she's not just a former handler. She's their mother. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably. Ashford's mind processed the implications of what he'd been told, connecting them to the situation unfolding 3 floors below. A dead soldier, still alive. 100 dogs, recognizing someone they should have forgotten years ago. An operation, launching in less than 2 days, now compromised by factors no one could have anticipated. Why? Ashford finally asked. Why would she come here? Why now? Sir, that's the question I keep returning to. A person doesn't spend 3 years in hiding, building a false identity, taking a menial job on a military installation, unless they have a specific purpose. Patterson closed her tablet. Operation Cerberus is sending those dogs into one of the most dangerous deployments in recent memory. The mission parameters, the extraction routes, the support allocations, everything about this operation has been designed for maximum effectiveness, but minimal survivability for the canine assets. Ashford's expression darkened. Those assessments are classified. Yes, sir. But if someone knew enough about the operation to understand what those dogs were facing, and if that someone had a personal connection to those animals that transcended professional obligation. Patterson met his gaze directly. Sir, I think Master Chief Hendricks came back because she knew her dogs were being sent to die, and she couldn't let that happen. The weight of that possibility settled over the room like a physical presence. Somewhere below them, 100 dogs waited alongside a woman who had sacrificed everything, her identity, her safety, her future, to protect animals that remembered her, despite the years and the distance. Get me Captain Crawford, Ashford said finally, and tell him to stand down on the detention order, at least until we know more. Yes, sir. Ann Patterson, he called, as she reached the door. This conversation doesn't leave this room. Whatever Master Chief Hendricks is doing here, she's earned the right to explain herself before we make any decisions. Patterson nodded once. Understood, Colonel. She left the room, and Ashford remained alone with questions that multiplied faster than he could process them. Phantom Unit, Operation Dark Shepherd. A woman who should be dead, surrounded by dogs who refused to forget her. The morning had promised routine. It had delivered resurrection instead. Word spread through the compound, despite Ashford's attempts at containment, carried by the unstoppable force of military gossip that no classification system had ever succeeded in suppressing. By 0900, every soldier on the installation knew that something significant had occurred at the K9 facility. By 0930, the nature of that something had been exaggerated into half a dozen competing narratives, each more dramatic than the last. But the truth, when it finally emerged, would prove more extraordinary than any fiction. Gunnery Sergeant Frank Holloway had been stationed at Fort Bragg for 17 years, long enough to witness the evolution of the K9 program from a supporting element to a critical operational asset. At 63 years old, he'd survived 3 wars and more close calls than he cared to count. The dog who had saved his life in Fallujah, a German shepherd named Victor, had been buried with full military honors in the post cemetery, the only acknowledgement Holloway had received for the bond that had carried him through the worst moments of his service. When he heard about the incident at the K9 compound, when the whispered name Ghost Mother reached his ears, something in his chest constricted with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. He found the compound still locked down, security personnel maintaining a perimeter that kept curious onlookers at bay. But Holloway had accumulated enough favors during his decades of service to bypass most obstacles. A word to the right sergeant, a nod from a sympathetic captain, and he was inside, making his way toward the center of the gathered crowd. What he saw there stopped him cold. The woman at the center of the K9 formation had aged since he'd last seen her, the lines around her eyes deeper, her hair showing threads of gray that hadn't been there before. But the posture was the same, the way she held her shoulders, the unconscious grace of someone who had spent their entire life moving among 4-legged warriors. Ghost Mother, he whispered, the name escaping before he could stop it. Sarah's head turned at the sound, her eyes finding him through the crowd. Recognition flickered across her features, followed by something that looked like gratitude mingled with regret. Gunnery Sergeant Holloway. Her voice carried no surprise, only acknowledgement. You still walk with a limp. The shrapnel in your knee never fully healed. You remember. I remember every handler who came through the program, every dog, every mission. Her gaze dropped briefly before returning to meet his. I remember Victor. He was one of my first graduates, 12 weeks old when he arrived at the facility. I spent 6 months with him before he was assigned to you. Holloway's composure cracked, moisture gathering at the corners of eyes that had remained dry through combat, through loss, through years of carrying memories that would never fully release their grip. Victor had been more than a dog to him. The animal had been a partner, a protector, a friend in an environment where friendship meant survival, and this woman had given him that gift. They told us you died, he said, his voice rough. Dark shepherd. Everyone lost. We mourned. We held services. We moved on because that's what soldiers do. I know, but you didn't die. No, I didn't. Sarah's expression carried the weight of 3 years spent in shadows, watching from a distance as the world continued without her. There were reasons, things I couldn't explain then, things I'm still not sure I can explain now. Holloway stepped forward, ignoring the growls that emerged from several dogs as he crossed their protective perimeter. He stopped directly before Sarah, close enough to see the faded scar tissue that curved along her jawline, a reminder of the blast that should have killed her. Then he dropped to one knee. Master Chief Sarah Hendricks, he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent compound. Phantom Unit, call sign Ghost Mother. Victor saved my life 4 times during my deployment. He took the bullet that would have put me in the ground. Every day I wake up and walk on 2 legs instead of being carried in a box, I owe to him. He looked up at her, tears now flowing freely down weathered cheeks. I owe to you, for giving me a partner who loved me more than he loved himself. The crowd had fallen completely silent. Even the dogs seemed to recognize the significance of the moment, their alertness giving way to something that resembled reverence. Sarah reached down, her hand touching Holloway's shoulder, with the gentleness of someone who understood exactly what her gift had meant. Stand up, Gunny. You don't kneel to me. You earned everything Victor gave you through your own courage. I just gave you a partner who could keep up. Holloway rose, but his eyes never left Sarah's face. Whatever you're doing here, whatever brought you back, I'm with you. Whatever you need. Before Sarah could respond, a new voice cut through the moment. Master Chief Hendricks. Captain Crawford had returned, his face carrying the expression of someone whose authority had been overruled and who intended to reassert it through sheer persistence. I've spoken with Colonel Ashford. He's requested your presence in Building 1 for a formal debriefing. His emphasis on the word requested carried no ambiguity about its actual meaning. Now, Sarah nodded slowly. I expected as much. She turned to look at the dogs surrounding her, 100 animals who had abandoned everything they had been conditioned to do simply because she had walked past their kennels. Shadow pressed against her leg, a low whine emerging from his throat, as if he sensed that their reunion was about to be interrupted. Stay, she commanded, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had shaped these animals from their earliest moments of consciousness. All of you, stay. The dogs obeyed, lowering themselves to the ground in synchronized submission. But their eyes followed Sarah as she stepped through their ranks, tracking her movement with an intensity that suggested their compliance was temporary. If she needed them, they would come. No command structure, no training protocol, no force on Earth would prevent them from reaching her side. Sarah walked toward Building 1, flanked by Crawford and a security detail whose presence felt more like escort than protection. Behind her, 100 dogs watched, waiting, and in the crowd, Master Sergeant Patterson pulled out her phone, composing a message to contacts she hadn't used in years. Ghost Mother is alive. Fort Bragg. Situation developing. Whatever happened next, the truth could no longer be contained, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the boundaries of this single installation. The interrogation room on the 2nd floor of Building 1 had been designed for exactly this purpose, extracting information from subjects who had reasons to conceal it. The walls were bare, the lighting harsh, the single table positioned to create psychological advantage for the questioner. Sarah sat in the metal chair with a comfort that suggested she'd occupied similar seats before, perhaps on the other side of the table. Her hands rested flat on the surface, fingers spread, posture relaxed in a way that spoke of extensive resistance training. Colonel Ashford occupied the seat across from her, a folder of documents before him that contained everything Patterson had assembled. Captain Crawford stood by the door, his presence a reminder that this conversation could escalate to formal detention at any moment. Master Chief Sarah Hendricks, Ashford began, reading from the top page. Born March 15, 1982, in Dayton, Ohio, enlisted at age 18. Assigned to military police initially, then transferred to the K-9 program after demonstrating exceptional aptitude. Selected for Phantom Unit in 2008. promoted to Master Chief in 2015, declared killed in action during Operation Dark Shepherd, April 23, 2021. He looked up from the file. That's what the records say. What do you say? Sarah met his gaze without flinching. The records are accurate except for the last part. You didn't die. Obviously. Then what happened? Sarah was silent for a long moment, her fingers pressing slightly harder against the table surface. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of memories she had spent 3 years trying to bury. Dark Shepherd was supposed to be an extraction. High-value targets in Kandahar province. 47 dogs, 23 handlers. We'd done similar missions 100 times before. She paused, her jaw tightening. We were betrayed. Someone gave up our insertion coordinates. The enemy was waiting for us. Who betrayed you? I don't know. Someone with access to operational details that only a handful of people should have possessed. The ambush was perfect. They knew exactly where we'd be and when we'd be there. The official report indicates no survivors. The official report was designed to protect whoever gave us up. Sarah's voice sharpened. 23 handlers died that night, 31 dogs. I watched my team get cut down around me while I tried to hold a position that couldn't be held. Her hands clenched briefly before she forced them flat again. I survived because the dogs protected me, formed a wall with their bodies while I found cover. Most of them died doing it. Crawford shifted by the door. That's a convenient story. One that can't be verified since you're claiming all the witnesses are dead. I'm claiming that people I loved are dead, Captain. Sarah's attention snapped to him with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step backward. I'm claiming that I spent 4 days in a cave system with 7 wounded dogs, waiting for extraction that never came because someone decided we weren't worth saving. I'm claiming that I walked 60 kilometers through hostile territory, carrying dogs who couldn't walk themselves, until I reached a forward operating base that was supposed to be friendly. What happened at the base? They tried to kill me too. Sarah's voice had gone flat, emotionless, in the way that suggested emotions too powerful to safely express. 2 men in American uniforms with weapons that didn't match their supposed units. I eliminated them. Then I ran, and I've been running ever since. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Crawford seemed reluctant to speak, the weight of Sarah's testimony pressing down on the room like a physical force. Why come here? Ashford finally asked. Why now? You could have stayed hidden forever. Sarah's expression shifted, the hardness giving way to something more vulnerable. The dogs, Colonel, my dogs. When Phantom Unit was terminated, the breeding program was distributed across other facilities. The animals I helped raise, the ones I imprinted during their critical developmental window, they ended up here. She gestured vaguely toward the canine compound beyond the walls. I kept track of them, watched from a distance, made sure they were being treated well. And then I learned about Operation Cerberus. Sarah's voice took on an edge that Ashford recognized as barely contained fury. I learned that 47 of my dogs are going to be deployed into a situation with a projected 60% casualty rate. 60%, Colonel. Nearly half of them are expected to die. Those projections are classified, and yet somehow a janitor found out about them. Sarah leaned forward. Sir, those dogs aren't just animals. They're soldiers. They trust their handlers to give them missions worth dying for. And what you're sending them into isn't a mission. It's a slaughter dressed up in operational objectives. Crawford stepped forward. Colonel, this woman has just admitted to accessing classified information and maintaining surveillance on military assets. That's... Captain Crawford, you will be silent. Ashford's command carried no room for argument. His attention remained fixed on Sarah. You came here to stop the operation. I came here to offer an alternative. I have intelligence about the insertion zone. Routes that aren't in your planning documents. Approaches that reduce exposure by 70%. Sarah's hands pressed flat against the table again, her entire posture conveying urgency. I spent 3 years in hiding, Colonel, but I spent those years watching, gathering information, preparing for the moment when I could actually make a difference. That moment is now. You expect me to trust intelligence from someone who's been living under a false identity, who infiltrated my installation under pretenses that constitute federal crimes. I expect you to weigh the cost of not trusting me against the lives of 47 dogs who will die if Operation Cerberus proceeds as planned. Sarah's voice softened. Colonel, I have nothing left to lose. My career, my identity, my connections to everything I valued, All of it was taken from me 3 years ago. The only thing I have left is a responsibility to the animals I helped create. If you send them into that insertion zone without the information I possess, you're killing them, and I won't stand by and watch that happen again." Ashford studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached down and opened the folder, flipping through pages until he found what he was looking for. "April 23rd, 2021, he read aloud. "Operation Dark Shepherd, 23 handlers killed in action, 31 military working dogs killed in action, 8 dogs missing in action, presumed dead." He looked up. 8 dogs, Master Chief. Not all of them died that night." Sarah's composure cracked, genuine shock breaking through the careful control she'd maintained throughout the interrogation. "What?" "Recent intelligence suggests that certain canine assets from Operation Dark Shepherd may have survived and been captured by hostile forces. They've been held at a black site in Syria, used for purposes we haven't fully determined." Ashford closed the folder. "This information arrived 48 hours ago. It's part of why Operation Cerberus was accelerated. We're not just deploying to accomplish mission objectives, Master Chief. We're deploying to recover American assets that have been held prisoner for 3 years. The color drained from Sarah's face. "My dogs. You're telling me my dogs from Dark Shepherd are still alive? That's what the intelligence suggests." Sarah's hands had begun to shake, the first loss of physical control she'd displayed since the interrogation began. Victor, Shadow's littermate, he was on that mission. He was one of the 8 missing. I'm aware. The mystery is about to unravel. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, drop a comment below telling us what you think Sarah's real identity is. Is she a former handler? A spy? Something else entirely? Share your theory and like this video if you want to see more stories about military heroes hiding in plain sight. Now, back to the revelation. The door to the interrogation room opened without warning, admitting a figure whose arrival changed the energy in the space immediately. Lieutenant Commander Drake Morrison wore his dress uniform despite the early hour, the ribbons on his chest speaking to a career that had seen more combat than most soldiers would experience in 3 lifetimes. He stopped 3 feet inside the room, his eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that spoke of history far deeper than professional acquaintance. "Sarah." The name emerged as a breath, wonder and disbelief compressed into 2 syllables. "They told me you were dead. I attended your memorial. I gave the eulogy." Sarah rose slowly from her chair, her composure completely shattered now, tears streaming down cheeks that had remained dry throughout her recounting of Dark Shepherd. "Drake, you're not supposed to be here." "The hell I'm not." Patterson sent word, said Ghost Mother was alive. Morrison crossed the remaining distance in 3 strides, pulling Sarah into an embrace that carried 3 years of grief being suddenly, impossibly resolved. "We thought we lost you, all of us, the whole community. I couldn't contact anyone. Whoever set us up in Kandahar, they had access to everything. My communications, my contacts, my entire network. If I reached out to anyone from the program, I'd be giving them another target. So you just vanished? Let everyone who loved you believe you were gone to protect everyone who loved me from whatever made me a target in the first place." Sarah pulled back from the embrace, her hands gripping Morrison's arms as if confirming his reality. "Drake, I spent 3 years in hiding, alone, watching everyone I cared about from a distance because being close to me meant being in danger." Morrison's jaw tightened. "That's not a decision you get to make for other people, Sarah. That's not how family works." "It's exactly how family works when the alternative is watching them die." Ashford cleared his throat, drawing both their attention. "Lieutenant Commander, I assume you have history with Master Chief Hendricks that goes beyond professional association." Morrison straightened, his military bearing reasserting itself despite the emotional moment. "Colonel, Sarah trained the dog team that saved my platoon during the Battle of Marjah. 14 men came home because of her digs, including me." He looked at Sarah with an expression that carried more than gratitude. "I owe her everything I have. If she's here, if she's alive, there's a reason. And whatever that reason is, I'm going to help her accomplish it. Commander, this woman has admitted to infiltrating the installation under false pretenses and accessing classified operational documents. Sir, with respect, this woman is the finest handler the military canine program has ever produced. 847 dogs trained with a 0-0 handler casualty rate. Whatever she's done, whatever rules she's broken, she's done it for reasons that serve American interests. I'd stake my career on that. That's a significant wager, Commander. It's a wager I'm prepared to make. The standoff held for a moment. Military hierarchy confronting personal loyalty in a clash that neither side could win through protocol alone. Then Ashford's expression shifted, something in Sarah's testimony and Morrison's advocacy apparently tipping a balance that had been undecided. Master Chief Hendricks, he turned to face Sarah directly. You claim to have intelligence that could reduce canine casualties during Operation Cerberus. You also claim that this intelligence cannot be verified through normal channels due to the circumstances of your disappearance. Yes, sir. Then we're going to verify it the only way available to us. You're going to review the operational plans and identify the deficiencies you've referenced. Commander Morrison will serve as your escort and verification officer. Captain Crawford, he looked at the intelligence officer, who had remained silent throughout Morrison's entrance. You will observe and report any discrepancies or concerns. Colonel, I must object. This is highly irregular. Everything about this situation is highly irregular, Captain. But if there's a chance that Master Chief Hendricks' intelligence can save lives, American lives, I'm obligated to pursue it regardless of how it was obtained. Ashford stood, gathering the folder. 1 hour. Operations Center. We'll review everything together. He left the room without waiting for acknowledgement, Crawford following with an expression that promised this matter was far from settled. Sarah and Morrison remained, the tension of the past hour slowly releasing into the reality of reunion. 3 years, Morrison said finally. You let me grieve for 3 years. I know. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't cover it, Sarah. Not even close. He reached up, touching her face with a gentleness that contradicted his words. But you're here now, alive, and apparently ready to save a bunch of dogs from a suicide mission. They're not just dogs, Drake. They're my family. The only family I have left. That's not true. His hand dropped to her shoulder, gripping with an intensity that spoke of promises he intended to keep. You have me. Whatever happens next, whatever consequences come from this, you have me. Sarah's composure, already fractured, finally broke completely. She leaned into Morrison's chest, allowing herself the luxury of being held by someone who understood the weight she'd been carrying alone for 3 years. Outside, the sun climbed higher over Fort Bragg, illuminating a compound where 100 dogs waited with patience that would have exhausted any lesser animal. They couldn't know what was happening in the buildings beyond their sight. They couldn't understand the strategic implications of operations and intelligence and military protocols, but they knew their mother was near, and they knew, with the certainty that only pure loyalty can provide, that she would return to them, whatever the cost. The operations center occupied the basement level of Building 1, its windowless walls hosting displays that tracked military assets across multiple continents. When Sarah entered, flanked by Morrison and followed at a distance by Crawford, she found a team of analysts already assembled around a central holographic display showing the Operation Cerberus insertion zone. Master Chief Hendricks? Colonel Ashford stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding immediate attention. You have 1 hour to demonstrate the value of your intelligence. I suggest you begin immediately. Sarah approached the display, her eyes scanning the terrain features and marked positions with the practiced assessment of someone who had planned similar operations throughout her career. What she saw confirmed her worst fears about the mission's design. The primary insertion point is here. She indicated a valley approximately 12 kilometers from the target facility. Flat terrain, minimal cover, with overlapping sight lines from 3 elevated positions. She traced the approach route with her finger. The dogs will be exposed for 17 minutes during the initial advance. That's 17 minutes of vulnerability before they reach any meaningful protection. Those positions have been analyzed, Crawford interjected. Drone surveillance indicates minimal enemy presence. Drone surveillance shows you what the enemy wants you to see. Sarah pulled up a secondary display, revealing imagery that the assembled analysts clearly didn't recognize. This is satellite coverage from a commercial source, purchased through channels that don't connect to military intelligence networks. The elevation points you've identified as clear contain hardened positions that were constructed specifically to avoid detection by standard reconnaissance. Where did you obtain this imagery? That's not relevant to the tactical discussion, Walton. What's relevant is that your dogs will walk directly into prepared kill zones if they follow the planned insertion route. Sarah expanded the display to show the broader operational area. The approach from the southeast is compromised. The approach from the northwest is compromised. The only viable insertion point is here. She indicated a position several kilometers from the current plan, through a canyon system that your intelligence hasn't fully mapped. Ashford studied the display with growing interest. And you know this canyon system? I walked through it 3 years ago, Colonel, during my extraction after Dark Shepherd. Sarah's voice carried the weight of that memory. It's difficult terrain, narrow passages, unstable footing, limited communication coverage, but it's invisible to enemy observation. Your dogs can reach the target facility without ever being detected. That's a significant claim. It's a claim I'm willing to verify personally. Sarah turned to face Ashford directly. Send me with the advance team. Let me guide them through the approach I'm describing. If I'm wrong, if my intelligence is faulty, I'll be the first one to pay the price. The room fell silent. Morrison's expression shifted from supportive to alarmed, the implications of Sarah's offer clearly registering. Crawford's hostility gave way to calculation, the intelligence officer apparently recognizing that Sarah was offering herself as collateral for her claims. Master Chief, Ashford said slowly, you're suggesting we deploy a civilian with a compromised identity on a classified military operation. I'm suggesting you deploy the best handler Phantom unit ever produced, using intelligence that no one else possesses, to save 47 dogs from an unnecessary death. Sarah's voice carried no uncertainty. Colonel, those animals trust their handlers to give them missions worth dying for. Help me give them a mission worth living through. The Operations Center's displays continued cycling through data, indifferent to the human drama playing out beneath them. Ashford studied Sarah with an expression that suggested he was weighing not just tactical considerations, but something far more personal. Commander Morrison, he said finally, in your professional assessment, is Master Chief Hendricks capable of executing the role she's describing? Morrison didn't hesitate. Sir, Sarah Hendricks trained dogs that saved more American lives than any statistical analysis could capture. She survived an ambush that killed everyone else in her unit. She walked 60 kilometers through hostile territory with wounded animals. She's been preparing for exactly this kind of mission for 3 years. He met Ashford's gaze directly. If anyone can guide those dogs through safely, it's her. And the risks? Sir, every operation carries risks, but the risk of not using the best asset available to us is higher than the risk of trusting someone who has repeatedly demonstrated her commitment to protecting American service members. Morrison paused, including the four-legged ones. Ashford was silent for a long moment, the weight of command pressing down on him in a way that no amount of experience could fully prepare anyone to handle. Careers would be made or destroyed by this decision. Lives, human and canine, hung in the balance. Captain Crawford, he said finally, begin integration of Master Chief Hendricks' intelligence into the operational planning. Commander Morrison, you will personally oversee her preparation and clearance for field deployment. He turned to Sarah. Master Chief, you have 42 hours to prove that everything you've told me is true. I suggest you use them wisely. Sarah nodded once, the weight of responsibility settling onto shoulders that had carried similar burdens before. Thank you, Colonel. You won't regret this. I certainly hope not, Master Chief. For both our sakes. The meeting dissolved into focused activity, analysts adjusting their displays to incorporate Sarah's intelligence, logistics officers beginning the complex process of modifying deployment plans on an accelerated timeline. Through it all, Sarah remained at the central display, her attention fixed on the terrain that would determine whether her dogs lived or died. Morrison moved to stand beside her, his presence a reminder that she was no longer facing these challenges alone. You know this is insane, he said quietly. Coming back from the dead to lead a mission into hostile territory based on 3-year-old intelligence. I know. You also know that if anything goes wrong, if one thing doesn't align with what you've told them, Crawford will have you in chains before the operation concludes. I know that too. Then why? Why risk everything you've built, everything you've survived, for dogs that most people would consider acceptable losses? Sarah turned to face him, her expression carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had made peace with their choices long before circumstances demanded action. Because they're not acceptable losses, Drake. Not to me, not to the handlers who trust them with their lives. Not to the families who will receive folded flags if this operation proceeds as planned. She looked back at the display, at the canyon system that represented salvation or destruction, depending on the accuracy of her memory. I couldn't save my team in Kandahar. I've lived with that failure every day for 3 years. But I can save these dogs. I can give them the chance that my dogs never had." Morrison was silent for a moment, absorbing the depth of commitment in her words. Then he reached out, taking her hand in a gesture that spoke of support without reservation. "Then we save them together." Outside, the sun had climbed to its midday position, casting sharp shadows across the compound, where 100 dogs continued their patient vigil. They couldn't know that their fate was being decided in classified briefings and operational modifications. But when Sarah finally emerged from Building 1, stepping into the sunlight, with a purpose that had been absent from her demeanor for 3 years, every single one of them rose to their feet. The dogs knew, and they were ready to follow her wherever the mission demanded. The night before deployment arrived with the particular stillness that preceded major operations, the calm that every veteran recognized as the universe holding its breath before chaos erupted. Sarah had been assigned temporary quarters in the visiting officer's wing, a gesture of status that felt strange after 11 months of sleeping in a janitor's closet on the far side of the compound. Sleep refused to come. She lay in the darkness, her mind cycling through the approach routes she'd memorized, the contingencies she'd planned, the 1,000 variables that could transform a successful mission into a catastrophe. The canyon system she'd described existed exactly as she remembered. Satellite confirmation had verified that much. But terrain and intelligence were only part of the equation. The dogs were the true variable. 100 animals who had abandoned their training protocols simply because she walked past their kennels. Tomorrow, those same animals would be asked to follow her into danger that exceeded anything their handlers had prepared them to face. Would their loyalty hold when the gunfire started? Would their conditioning reassert itself when chaos erupted? Or would they remain focused on her, the woman who had shaped their earliest memories, trusting her judgment even when every instinct screamed at them to run? A knock at her door interrupted the spiral of anxiety. "It's Morrison," came the voice from the corridor. "Can I come in?" Sarah rose, crossing to the door and opening it to find the lieutenant commander standing in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested he understood exactly what she'd been experiencing. "Figured you'd be awake," he said, handing her one of the cups. "Pre-mission insomnia is basically standard protocol at this point." She accepted the coffee, stepping aside to let him enter. "How did you know?" "Because I've known you for 12 years, Sarah. And because I'm experiencing the same thing." He settled into the room's only chair, his posture carrying the controlled tension of someone preparing for combat. "Tomorrow changes everything. Either we pull this off and you become the miracle story that the K9 program will tell for generations, or we fail, and I get added to the long list of people who died trying to do the right thing." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, cradling the coffee cup for its warmth rather than its contents. "I've made my peace with that outcome, Drake." "Have you?" The question carried more than casual inquiry. Morrison had seen Sarah at her best and at her worst, had witnessed her triumph over challenges that would have broken most operators. He knew her capacity for courage, but he also knew her capacity for guilt, the weight she carried for every dog she'd lost, every handler who'd trusted her training and paid the ultimate price. "The 8 dogs from Dark Shepherd," Sarah said finally, "Victor and the others, if they're really alive, if they've been held prisoner for 3 years, we'll get them back. You don't know that. We don't even know for certain they're at the facility. Intel suggests, but Intel has been wrong before. Intel was wrong about Kandahar." "Sarah." Morrison leaned forward, his voice carrying the intensity of conviction. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever we find at that facility, you've already accomplished something that nobody thought possible. You came back from the dead. You exposed a mission plan that would have killed nearly half the dogs assigned to it. You gave those animals a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. Chances aren't guarantees. No, they're not. But they're better than nothing, which is what those dogs had before you showed up." He reached out, taking her free hand in his. "Sarah, you've spent 3 years punishing yourself for surviving when your team didn't. You've built a prison out of guilt and locked yourself inside it. Tomorrow is your chance to break out, not just for the dogs, for yourself." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, the weight of his words pressing against defenses she'd constructed through years of isolation. Morrison was right. She had been punishing herself. Every day of her hidden existence had been an extension of the survivor's guilt that plagued her after Kandahar. "I don't know how to be anything else anymore," she admitted. The handler I was before Dark Shepherd, she died in that ambush. What's left is just fragments, pieces trying to pretend they form a whole person. Then let the fragments be enough. Morrison squeezed her hand. Let them be enough to get through tomorrow. And then, when it's over, maybe we can help you put some of those pieces back together. The first light of dawn was beginning to color the eastern sky when Sarah finally allowed herself to believe that survival was possible. Not guaranteed, never guaranteed, but possible. And for the first time in 3 years, possibility felt like enough. The morning of deployment arrived with a sky the color of gunmetal, clouds pressing low over Fort Bragg as if the atmosphere itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Sarah stood at the edge of the K9 compound, watching handlers prepare their animals for transport, while she waited for the final briefing that would determine whether her 3 years of planning would amount to salvation or destruction. 100 dogs moved through the pre-deployment routine with the disciplined efficiency that months of training had instilled. Equipment checks, medical assessments, final bonding moments between handlers and their four-legged partners. The compound hummed with purposeful activity, every participant aware that the next 48 hours would test everything they had prepared for. Shadow remained at Sarah's side, his presence a constant since the moment she'd emerged from Building 1 the previous day. The other dogs had returned to their handlers after Colonel Ashford's intervention, accepting the temporary separation with reluctance that their training couldn't fully suppress. But Shadow had refused to leave her, and eventually the command structure had simply accepted this deviation from protocol. Some bonds, it seemed, transcended military regulations. Master Chief, Lieutenant Commander Morrison approached, his tactical gear already secured, his expression carrying the focused intensity of an operator preparing for combat. Transport leaves in 30 minutes. Colonel Ashford wants a final word before we move out. Sarah nodded, her hand dropping to rest on Shadow's head in a gesture that had become automatic over the past 2 days. Any last-minute changes to the approach? Negative. Your intelligence held up under every verification we could manage. The canyon route is confirmed viable. Enemy positions are exactly where you said they'd be. Morrison paused, something shifting in his expression. Sarah, whatever happens out there, I want you to know that what you've done here matters. The handlers, the dogs, the entire operation. You've given them a chance they wouldn't have had. Save the speeches for after we bring everyone home, Drake. That's not a speech. That's a statement of fact. He gestured toward Building 1. Ashford's waiting. Let's not keep him. The walk across the compound drew attention from every handler they passed. Word had spread throughout the installation about the woman who had appeared from nowhere, surrounded by dogs that refused to obey anyone else, carrying intelligence that had completely restructured a major operation. Some looked at Sarah with suspicion, the natural wariness of soldiers confronting an unknown variable. Others watched with something closer to hope, recognizing that her presence represented possibilities they hadn't dared consider. Specialist Fletcher intercepted them halfway across the parking lot, his young face carrying an expression that had evolved considerably since his initial accusations of espionage. Master Chief Hendricks. His voice lacked the hostility of their first encounter, replaced by something that sounded almost like respect. I wanted to apologize. Before the mission, what I said about you being a spy, about compromising the program, I was wrong. Sarah studied him for a moment, reading the genuine contrition in his posture. You were protecting your unit, Specialist. That's not something that requires an apology. Maybe not, but the way I said it, the assumptions I made, you deserved better than that. Fletcher straightened, his shoulders squaring with military precision. Whatever happens today, I wanted you to know that my dog, Ranger, he's one of yours, from the breeding program. I checked the records. I remember Ranger, brown patch behind his left ear, tendency to favor his right side during tracking exercises. Fletcher's eyes widened. That's exactly right. How did you... I remember all of them, Specialist. Every single one. Sarah's voice softened. Take care of him out there. He'll take care of you if you let him. Yes, ma'am, I will. Fletcher stepped aside, allowing Sarah and Morrison to continue toward Building 1. Behind them, the young specialist watched their departure with an expression that suggested his understanding of the world had just expanded in ways he was still processing. Colonel Ashford waited in his office, the space cleared of its usual administrative clutter to accommodate the tactical displays that now dominated every surface. Captain Crawford stood in the corner, his presence a reminder that not everyone had accepted Sarah's sudden integration into the operational structure. Master Chief? Ashford rose as she entered, a gesture of respect that carried significance in the rigid hierarchy of military protocol. We're T-minus 28 minutes to transport departure. I wanted a final confirmation before we commit resources. The intelligence is solid, Colonel. The approach route will work. And if it doesn't, if the enemy has somehow anticipated our modified plan? Sarah met his gaze without flinching. Then I'll be the first one through the breach, sir. Whatever price needs to be paid for my intelligence being wrong, I'll pay it personally. Ashford studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once, apparently satisfied with whatever he had seen in her response. There's one more thing you should know before we deploy. He turned to the tactical display, pulling up an image that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Satellite reconnaissance from 6 hours ago, the facility where we believe the Dark Shepherd dogs are being held. The image showed a compound surrounded by desert terrain, its structures arranged in a pattern that spoke of military purpose rather than the civilian function. But it wasn't the buildings that seized Sarah's attention. It was the kennels, row after row of them, visible at the edge of the facility's perimeter. Thermal imaging confirms canine presence, Ashford continued. Approximately 15 animals, consistent with the 8 missing from Dark Shepherd, plus additional captures we hadn't previously identified. 15 dogs, not 8. The enemy had been collecting military working dogs for 3 years, building a force of animals that had been trained by American handlers and then repurposed for unknown objectives. Colonel, Sarah's voice emerged steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her composure. Those dogs, if they've been held for 3 years, subjected to whatever conditioning the enemy has attempted, they may not be the animals we remember. That's a possibility we've considered. The operational plan includes provisions for hostile canine encounters. Ashford's voice carried a weight that suggested he understood exactly what he was asking. Master Chief, if those dogs have been turned against us, if they pose a threat to our personnel, I understand, sir. Do you? Because I need to know that you can make difficult decisions if the situation demands them. These aren't just assets we're discussing. They're animals you helped raise. Sarah was silent for a long moment, her mind cycling through scenarios she had spent 3 years trying not to imagine. Victor, Shadow's littermate, potentially conditioned to attack American soldiers. The other dogs from Dark Shepherd, their loyalty corrupted by captivity and whatever techniques their captors had employed. Colonel, I've already made the most difficult decision of my life. I survived when my team didn't. I've carried that weight for 3 years. She looked up, her expression carrying the quiet resolve of someone who had made peace with impossible choices. If those dogs have been turned, if they can't be recovered, I'll do what needs to be done. But I won't accept that outcome until I've seen it with my own eyes. Ashford nodded slowly. That's all I needed to hear, Master Chief. Good luck out there. The transport aircraft lifted off at precisely 0700, carrying 47 dogs and their handlers toward a destiny that would be determined in the hours ahead. Sarah occupied a position near the front of the cargo bay, Shadow pressed against her leg with the steadfast loyalty that had characterized their reunion. Around her, handlers performed final equipment checks and spoke quietly to their animals, the pre-mission rituals that helped transform anxiety into focused purpose. Some glanced at Sarah with expressions that ranged from curiosity to skepticism, but none challenged her presence. Colonel Ashford's authorization had settled whatever questions remained about her role in the operation. Morrison sat beside her, his attention divided between tactical displays and periodic assessments of her emotional state. "You're quiet. Processing. Anything you want to share?" Sarah looked out the small window, watching clouds slide past as the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude. "I've imagined this moment 1,000 times, going back, finding out what really happened to my dogs, getting answers that nobody wanted to give me." She paused, her hand tightening on Shadow's collar. "I never imagined it would feel like this." "Like what?" "Like I'm walking towards something I can't come back from. Whatever we find at that facility, whatever condition those dogs are in, it's going to change everything I thought I understood about Dark Shepherd." Morrison was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. "Maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe the truth, whatever it is, will finally let you stop running. Or maybe it will confirm that running was the right choice all along." The aircraft continued its journey, carrying its cargo of soldiers and animals toward a confrontation that had been building for 3 years. Below, the terrain shifted from American farmland to ocean, then to the distant shores of continents where American interests intersected with global instability. Sarah closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of stillness before the chaos began. Whatever waited at the end of this flight, she would face it. For her dogs, for her team, for the truth that had been buried beneath 3 years of silence and shadow. The insertion went exactly as Sarah had planned. The canyon system she'd described from memory proved even more effective than satellite imagery had suggested. Narrow passages concealed movement from elevated observation points. Natural rock formations provided cover that no amount of engineering could have replicated. The dogs moved through the terrain with the sure-footed confidence of animals designed for exactly this kind of environment. Sarah led the advance element, Shadow at her side, her body remembering the route she'd traveled 3 years earlier under circumstances far more desperate than these. Every turn, every obstacle, every potential hazard point existed exactly where her memory had placed them. 300 meters to the facility perimeter, Morrison's voice came through her earpiece. Thermal shows minimal activity. Looks like your intelligence was right about the guard rotation. They change shifts at 1100 local time. We have a 7-minute window before the next patrol. Then let's not waste it. The assault team emerged from the canyon system like ghosts materializing from stone, their movements coordinated with the precision that only extensive training could produce. Dogs fanned out in predetermined sorterns, their handlers following with weapons ready and senses alert. Sarah's attention fixed on the kennels at the facility's edge. Even from this distance, she could hear the barking, the sound of animals responding to the approach of unfamiliar forces. Her heart rate elevated despite years of conditioning designed to suppress exactly this kind of emotional response. Somewhere in those kennels, dogs she had raised from puppies were waiting. Dogs who had been her responsibility, her family, before Dark Shepherd had torn everything apart. The perimeter breach occurred without incident, the assault team flowing through gaps in the security coverage that Sarah's intelligence had identified. Resistance materialized in scattered pockets, quickly suppressed by operators who had trained for exactly these scenarios. The dogs performed flawlessly, their conditioning holding despite the chaos of combat. And then Sarah reached the kennels. The first cage she approached contained a German shepherd, whose markings she recognized immediately. Patches of gray had appeared around the animal's muzzle, the passage of 3 years visible in ways that made Sarah's chest constrict with emotion. "Victor," she breathed. The dog's head snapped toward her voice, ears rotating to track the sound. For a moment, nothing happened. 3 years of captivity, of unknown conditioning, of separation from everything the animal had known. Then Victor's tail began to wag. Sarah dropped it to her knees before the cage, her hands reaching through the bars to touch the dog who had been Shadow's littermate, the animal she had raised from 8 weeks old and watched develop into one of the finest military working dogs the program had ever produced. Victor pressed against the bars, his tongue reaching to lick her fingers, his entire body vibrating with recognition that transcended the years and the distance. "I'm here, boy. I'm here. I came back for you." The other dogs in the surrounding kennels began responding, their barking shifting from alarm to something that sounded almost like celebration. These were Phantom Unit dogs, animals who had been shaped by Sarah's techniques during their most formative developmental stages. Whatever the enemy had tried to do to them, whatever conditioning they'd attempted to impose, the fundamental bond remained intact. Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Sarah, we've secured the main facility. 8 dogs recovered from the kennels. All appear healthy, no signs of hostile conditioning." 15, Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "The thermal showed 15. We've only found 8. The others—" Morrison paused. "Sarah, there's something you need to see. Main building, 2nd floor." She left Victor's cage with a promise to return, making her way through the facility toward the location Morrison had indicated. The corridor showed signs of hasty evacuation, equipment abandoned, documents scattered, the detritus of an operation that had been interrupted before completion. The room on the 2nd floor had been configured as a command center, its walls covered with photographs and documents that made Sarah's blood run cold. Surveillance images of American military installations, K9 training facilities from bases across the country, individual photographs of handlers, their names and unit assignments annotated in Cyrillic script, and in the center of it all, a board displaying 7 photographs of dogs with American military markings. Below each image, a single word in English: terminated. Sarah stared at the board, her mind processing what the images represented. 7 of the 15 dogs the enemy had captured hadn't survived whatever purposes they'd been intended to serve. 7 animals who had trusted their handlers, trusted their training, trusted the humans who had shaped their existence. Gone. Morrison appeared at her shoulder, his expression grim. We found records. The dogs that didn't survive, they were used as test subjects. Some kind of conditioning program designed to turn military working dogs against their handlers. And the 8 we recovered? Best guess? They were resistant. Whatever techniques the enemy tried, these dogs wouldn't break. Morrison's voice softened. They waited for you, Sarah. 3 years of captivity, and they never stopped waiting. Sarah's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her face as the weight of revelation crashed over her. Her dogs. Her responsibility. 7 of them dead because she hadn't been there to protect them. But 8 had survived. 8 had held on to whatever fragment of their training, their loyalty, their connection to the woman who had shaped their earliest memories. And now they were going home. We need to move, Morrison said gently. Extraction in 15 minutes. Whatever else is here, the intelligence teams can process it later. Sarah wiped her eyes, forcing her emotions back behind the professional facade that had carried her through darker moments than this. The dogs from the kennels, Victor and the others, they're coming with us. Already arranged. Ashford approved their extraction the moment we confirmed their presence. She nodded, turning away from the board with its photographs of the dead. There would be time to mourn later, time to process the full scope of what had been done to her animals. But for now, the living required her attention. The extraction proceeded without complications, the assault team withdrawing through the same canyon system that had provided their approach. Sarah walked among the recovered dogs, speaking to each of them in the language they remembered, reinforcing bonds that captivity had strained but not broken. Victor stayed close to her throughout the journey, his aging body moving with determination that belied the years of imprisonment he'd endured. Occasionally, he would press against her leg, seeking the reassurance of contact with the human who had given him his earliest understanding of the world. Shadow watched his littermate with an intensity that spoke of recognition, beyond simple familial connection. These dogs had been separated for 3 years, had experienced transformations that should have made them strangers to each other. Yet when Victor finally approached Shadow during a brief rest stop, the 2 animals touched noses with the gentleness of brothers reunited after an impossible journey. Sarah watched them, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to believe that healing was possible. The return to Fort Bragg carried the particular energy of successful operations, the relief of objectives achieved mixed with the exhaustion of sustained high-intensity performance. But this homecoming carried additional weight that no standard mission debrief could capture. Word had spread throughout the installation during the team's absence. The story of Ghost Mother, the dead handler who had returned to save her dogs, had transformed from rumor to legend in the span of 48 hours. When the transport aircraft touched down, a crowd had assembled that exceeded anything Sarah had anticipated. Handlers from every canine unit on the base, support personnel who had heard fragments of the story, officers who wanted to witness the conclusion of events that had disrupted their carefully ordered existence. And at the front of the crowd, standing with military precision despite the emotion visible on their faces, stood the 5 people who had most strongly opposed Sarah's presence just 3 days earlier. Chief Warrant Officer Cole Barrett stepped forward as Sarah descended from the aircraft, Shadow at her side, Victor following close behind. The SEAL operator who had dismissed her as an inconvenient civilian now carried himself with the humble bearing of someone who had been fundamentally wrong and knew it. Master Chief Hendricks, his voice carried across the assembled crowd. Permission to speak. Sarah stopped before him, her expression neutral, despite the exhaustion that weighed on every muscle. Granted, Chief. Barrett dropped to one knee, the gesture sending a ripple of shock through the watching crowd. Navy SEALs did not kneel. It simply wasn't done. Yet, here was a 23-year veteran, an operator whose reputation had been built on unwavering strength, kneeling before a woman he had tried to eject from the compound less than a week earlier. I was wrong, he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine contrition. Completely wrong. About you, about what you represented, about everything. His eyes lifted to meet hers. I spent my career believing that strength meant never backing down, never admitting weakness, never acknowledging that someone else might know more than I did. You showed me that real strength is something entirely different. Stand up, Chief. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. You were protecting your mission. That's what warriors do. Warriors also recognize when they've encountered something greater than themselves. Barrett rose but remained at attention. Master Chief, I've led men into combat situations that most people can't imagine. But what you did, coming back from the dead to save animals that most commanders would have written off as acceptable losses, that's a kind of courage I'm not sure I possess. You possess it, Chief. You just haven't been tested in the right way yet. Sarah reached out, placing her hand on his shoulder. Take care of your team. That's all any of us can do. Lieutenant Nicole Stafford approached next, her earlier hostility completely absent, replaced by something that looked remarkably like awe. Master Chief, I've spent 6 months trying to prove that I belonged in command of this unit, trying to demonstrate that a woman could lead canine operations as effectively as any man. She shook her head slowly. And then you appeared, and in 3 days, you showed everyone what female leadership actually looks like. Leadership isn't about gender, Lieutenant. It's about commitment, about being willing to sacrifice everything for the people and animals under your care. I know that now. I'm not sure I understood it before. Stafford straightened. With your permission, I'd like to recommend that you be reinstated to active duty and assigned as senior advisor to the Canine Training Program. We need your expertise. We need your experience. And honestly, she smiled slightly, we need someone to remind us why we do this in the first place. Sergeant First Class Brad Lawson stepped forward before Sarah could respond, his face carrying the evidence of emotions he was struggling to contain. Shadow, still at Sarah's side, watched his former handler with an expression that seemed almost sympathetic. Master Chief, Lawson's voice cracked slightly. Shadow never let anyone touch him. 3 years I've worked with that dog, and he never once showed me the kind of affection he showed you in the first 30 seconds. He looked at the Belgian Malinois, then back at Sarah. I thought I was a good handler. I thought I understood these animals. Now I realize I was just going through the motions. You are a good handler, Sergeant. Shadow's behavior toward me isn't a reflection of your inadequacy. It's a reflection of bonds that were formed before you ever met him. Sarah reached down, her hand resting on Shadow's head. These dogs don't forget. They can't. Their memories of early attachment are literally wired into their neural structure. What Shadow feels for me isn't something you could have prevented or replaced. Then how do I compete with that? You don't compete with it. You build alongside it. Sarah gestured toward Victor, who had remained close since their extraction from the facility. Shadow's brother. They were separated for 3 years, experienced completely different lives. Yet the moment they reunited, the bond was still there. She met Lawson's gaze. These animals have unlimited capacity for loyalty. What Shadow feels for me doesn't diminish what he can feel for you. It just means he has more love to give than most humans know how to receive. The crowd had grown silent, witnesses to exchanges that transcended the usual boundaries of military protocol. Somewhere in the assembly, phones were recording, capturing moments that would spread far beyond the boundaries of Fort Bragg. Specialist Ryan Fletcher pushed through to the front, his young face carrying the particular expression of someone whose worldview had been completely restructured. Master Chief, I accused you of being a spy, of trying to compromise our program, of being a threat that needed to be eliminated. I remember, Specialist. I was an idiot. The admission came without hesitation. I was so convinced that I understood how the world worked, that anything outside my experience must be suspicious or dangerous. You showed me how limited that thinking really is. He straightened, his posture reflecting the military bearing that training had instilled. With your permission, I'd like to learn from you, whatever you're willing to teach about handling, about bonding, about being the kind of person these dogs deserve. I want to learn all of it. Sarah studied him for a moment, reading the genuine desire for growth that had replaced his earlier hostility. Learning requires humility, Specialist. The willingness to admit that everything you think you know might be wrong. After this week, that won't be a problem. Captain Dennis Crawford approached last, his intelligence officer's skepticism clearly struggling against the evidence that surrounded him. Of all the antagonists Sarah had faced, he represented the most difficult conversion, his entire professional identity built on suspicion and verification. Master Chief Hendricks, his voice carried formal precision, I recommended your detention. I questioned your intelligence. I suggested that your presence represented a security threat that required immediate neutralization. You were doing your job, Captain. I was doing my job badly. The admission seemed to cost him something. Good intelligence work requires the ability to recognize when established assumptions are wrong. I was so focused on the security protocols you had violated that I failed to see the strategic asset you represented. He came to attention, his hand rising in a formal salute. Forgive me, Master Chief. I should have recognized what you were from the beginning. Sarah returned the salute with the precision of someone who had performed the gesture thousands of times throughout her career. Recognition isn't about seeing what's in front of you, Captain. It's about understanding what that observation means. You weren't wrong to be suspicious. You were wrong to stop there. The crowd remained frozen, processing the series of reconciliations they had witnessed. These weren't just apologies being exchanged, they were transformations. Fundamental shifts in understanding that would ripple through the installation's culture for years to come. What an incredible story of loyalty that transcends time and training. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that true heroes don't advertise. Subscribe if you haven't already, and check out our other military stories linked above. Drop a salute emoji in the comments to honor Sarah and handlers like her who serve in the shadows. Until next time, stay strong. Colonel Ashford emerged from Building 1, his arrival creating a corridor through the assembled crowd. He walked directly to Sarah, his expression carrying the weight of decisions that extended far beyond this single moment. Master Chief Hendricks, his voice carried across the silent compound, your intelligence proved accurate. Your leadership during the operation exceeded all expectations. The dogs we recovered from that facility are alive because of your preparation and your courage. Thank you, Colonel. I'm not finished. Ashford reached into his jacket, withdrawing a document that bore official seals Sarah recognized from her years of service. Effective immediately, you are reinstated to active duty with full restoration of rank and privileges. Your service record has been corrected to reflect that you were not killed in action during Operation Dark Shepherd, but rather survived under circumstances that required temporary separation from military service. The crowd erupted in applause that seemed to emerge from deep within in the collective consciousness of everyone present. Handlers who had watched Sarah save Luna, who had witnessed her navigate the politics of suspicion and accusation, who had seen her lead their dogs through dangers that should have been insurmountable. Sarah accepted the document with hands that trembled slightly, the reality of what was happening finally breaking through the professional composure she had maintained throughout the day. Colonel, I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Master Chief. Your actions have spoken more eloquently than words ever could. Ashford paused, something shifting in his expression. There is, however, one more matter we need to discuss. In private. The crowd's energy shifted, recognizing that something significant remained unaddressed. Sarah followed Ashford toward Building 1, Morrison falling into step beside her, Shadow and Victor trailing behind like an honor guard of fur and loyalty. The conference room on the third floor had been cleared of its tactical displays, replaced by a single communication terminal that showed a live feed from a facility Sarah didn't recognize. On the screen, a man in civilian clothes sat at a table covered with documents and photographs. Master Chief Hendricks, Ashford began, this is Director Marcus Webb from the Defense Intelligence Agency. He has information that you need to hear. The man on the screen nodded in greeting. Master Chief, I'll get straight to the point. The facility your team raided was not the primary objective of the enemy's canine program. It was a satellite location, used for testing and development. Sarah's blood ran cold. There are more facilities? At least 3 that we've identified, possibly more. The program has been operating for longer than we initially assessed, capturing military working dogs from multiple allied nations and attempting to reverse their conditioning. Webb pulled up an image that made Sarah's hands clench. This is the primary facility, located in a region where direct military intervention would create diplomatic complications. How many dogs? Current estimates suggest between 40 and 60 animals. American, British, German, Israeli, all captured during operations over the past decade, all presumed dead by their respective governments. Sarah turned to Ashford, her expression carrying an intensity that made even the colonel take an involuntary step backward. We have to get them out. Master Chief, the diplomatic implications, I don't care about diplomatic implications. I care about dogs that are being held prisoner, being tortured, being used against the countries they were trained to serve. Her voice rose. Every day we delay is another day those animals suffer, another day they wonder why nobody came for them. Sarah, Morrison's voice cut through her escalating emotion. Nobody's saying we abandon them. We're saying we need to be smart about how we proceed. Director Webb nodded. Master Chief, your success today has changed the equation significantly. The intelligence we recovered from the satellite facility, combined with your first-hand knowledge of enemy capabilities, creates opportunities that didn't exist before. What kind of opportunities? The kind that require careful planning, extensive preparation, and the leadership of someone who understands these animals at a level no one else can match. Webb leaned forward. Master Chief Hendricks, I'm authorized to offer you command of a joint task force specifically designed to locate and recover military working dogs held by hostile forces worldwide. Full operational authority, resources drawn from multiple agencies, and a mandate that extends as far as you're willing to take it. The weight of the offer pressed down on Sarah's shoulders with physical force. Not just a mission, a purpose, a reason to continue fighting that extended beyond the dogs she'd already saved. And the dogs we recovered today, Victor and the others, they'll be rehabilitated and, if you choose to accept this assignment, integrated into your task force as working assets. Webb smiled slightly. Assuming they're willing to work with anyone else. Sarah looked down at Shadow, who had positioned himself at her feet with the patient attentiveness of an animal awaiting commands. Then at Victor, whose aged muzzle carried the evidence of 3 years endured in the hope of exactly this moment. I'll need Morrison as my executive officer. Done. And full access to Phantom Unit training protocols. The originals, not the sanitized versions that were distributed after the program shut down. That can be arranged. And one more thing, Sarah's voice hardened. Whoever betrayed my team in Kandahar, whoever sold our insertion coordinates to the enemy and then covered it up when we were supposed to be dead, I want them found. I want them held accountable, and I want to be there when justice is served. Director Webb was silent for a moment, clearly weighing the implications of Sarah's demand. Master Chief, that investigation involves classified information at the highest levels. Pursuing it could lead to places that make even experienced operators uncomfortable. I've spent 3 years being uncomfortable, Director. I've slept in janitors' closets and eaten from vending machines and watched the world continue without me because someone decided my team was expendable. Sarah's eyes blazed with an intensity that made everyone in the room shift slightly. Whatever it takes, whatever I have to face, I want the truth. Then you'll have it, Webb nodded once. Welcome to Task Force Shadow, Master Chief. Your dogs are waiting. 3 days later, Sarah stood before a formation of handlers and dogs that represented the future of military canine operations. The compound had been transformed from a temporary crisis response center into the permanent headquarters of an organization that didn't officially exist. Morrison stood at her right hand, his presence a constant reminder that she was no longer facing these challenges alone. Behind them, Shadow and Victor maintained their positions with the disciplined attention of animals who understood that this moment carried significance beyond their ability to comprehend. You've all heard the stories, Sarah began, her voice carrying across the assembled formation. Ghost Mother, the handler who came back from the dead, the woman who saved 100 dogs from a suicide mission. She paused, letting the silence emphasize her next words. Those stories are incomplete. The handlers listened with absolute attention, recognizing that whatever followed would shape their understanding of everything that they'd been asked to believe. I didn't come back from the dead. I survived when I shouldn't have, and I spent 3 years hiding because I was afraid. Afraid of whoever betrayed my team. Afraid of what I'd find if I started looking for answers. Afraid of failing the dogs I'd already lost. Sarah's voice softened. Fear kept me in the shadows for 3 years. But it was love that brought me back. She gestured toward the recovered dogs, the animals she'd raised from puppies who had somehow held on to their loyalty through years of captivity. These dogs waited for me, through imprisonment, through torture, through conditions that would have broken most humans. They waited because they believed I would come, because the bond we formed in their earliest weeks of life was stronger than anything their captors could impose. Her gaze swept across the formation, meeting the eyes of handlers who were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd been recruited into. There are more dogs out there, dozens, maybe hundreds, animals who served their countries faithfully and were abandoned when the cost of recovering them became inconvenient. They're waiting too, waiting for someone to remember that their lives matter, that their loyalty deserves to be repaid. Sarah straightened, her posture carrying the authority of someone who had earned every ounce of respect through sacrifice and determination. Task Force Shadow exists to bring them home, every single one, no matter where they're held, no matter what it costs, no matter how long it takes. She paused. "Who's with me?" The response came without hesitation. Every handler in the formation raised their hand. Every dog responded to their partner's energy, ears forward, attention focused, ready for whatever mission awaited. Sarah looked at Morrison, who smiled with an expression that carried more pride than she'd ever seen from him before. "Looks like you've got yourself an army, Master Chief." "No?" Sarah's hand dropped to rest on Shadow's head, feeling the warmth of the animal who had started everything by refusing to let her walk away. "I've got myself a family." The sun was setting over Fort Bragg, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost theatrical in their beauty. Sarah watched it from the window of her new office. Shadow at her feet, Victor curled in a bed nearby, the sounds of handlers training with their dogs drifting up from the compound below. Her phone buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced at the screen, expecting operational updates or administrative details. Instead, she found a single photograph and 3 words. The photograph showed a dog she recognized immediately, a Belgian Malinois with distinctive markings on his chest, an animal she had trained personally, had watched develop from an uncertain puppy into a confident warrior, an animal who had been listed as killed in action during Operation Dark Shepherd. The 3 words below the photograph made her heart stop. "He remembers you." Sarah stared at the message, her mind racing through implications that extended far beyond what she'd prepared for. The recovery operation had been completed, the known facilities had been identified, the dogs they had found had been accounted for, but this photograph showed a location she didn't recognize. A dog who shouldn't exist. A message from a sender whose identity her phone couldn't trace. Shadow lifted his head, sensing the change in her energy. Victor stirred from his bed, both animals responding to their handler's sudden tension, with the alertness that years of training had instilled. Sarah looked at her dogs, then back at the photograph on her phone. "Looks like we're not done yet, boys." Shadow's tail wagged once. Victor rose to his feet, his aging body straightening with a determination that belied his years. Outside, the sunset continued its display, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath its colors. But somewhere in the world, in a location that remained to be discovered, a dog was waiting, and Ghost Mother was coming. The meaning behind the story. This story reminds us of a truth we often forget in our rush to judge others by their appearance, their job title, or their social status. The woman mopping floors might have saved more lives than the decorated officer walking past her. The quiet person in the corner might carry scars from battles we cannot imagine. Sarah Hendricks spent 3 years in shadows, not because she sought recognition, but because her love for those she trained transcended her own safety, her own comfort, her own identity. She gave up everything, her name, her career, her connections, to protect animals that most people would dismiss as acceptable losses. The lesson here is profound. True loyalty does not expire. True bonds cannot be broken by time or distance. The dogs remembered their mother after 3 years of separation because love imprints itself on the soul in ways that no amount of conditioning can erase. We live in a world that celebrates the loud, the visible, the self-promoting, but the real heroes often work in silence. They clean floors, they serve coffee, they wear uniforms that nobody notices. And when the moment demands it, they rise. If this story moved you, carry its message forward. Thank a veteran today. Donate to organizations that support military working dogs. Look twice at the person everyone else overlooks, because you never know whose quiet strength might one day save your life. Real warriors do not advertise. They simply show up when it matters most. Share this story. Honor those who serve in shadows. And never forget that loyalty, once given truly, lasts forever.